Hello and welcome. I'm Jacob Henry Leviton, Communications, Programs, and Research Outreach Specialist here at the Humanities Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you here and on Zoom to the second of our two events comprising our autumn series on the subject of appropriation. The Humanities Institute is a vital space where diverse concepts and creativities come together, and we hope you'll find today's dialogue inspiring and enriching. Before introducing our speakers today, I want to draw our collective attention to a few of our upcoming events. This Friday, we continue the Fall Writing Studio led by Professor Chris Jones in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies. With 2 meetings remaining, it's not too late to get involved and complete some writing as part of an expertly guided community of scholars from across the university. Then, on Thursday, September 26th, in the entire Humanities Institute space, the Array, as we call it, we are pleased to open the art exhibition, Weird Flex, the Anthropocene in Flux. We just had occasion today to meet with the exhibition's curator, Professor Juan Obando Echeverri, and some of the artists who will be sharing their work as part of the show. And when I say this, I truly mean it after hearing about the works from the artists today. To say it's extraordinary is an understatement. Works there will think through the politics of space and the disruption of natural ecologies in the borderlands, the poetry and poetics of the creatures with whom we share space in the desert, the 24/7 always-on demands of work under what might be called late capitalism, and more. So we hope you'll join. The reception with which we'll open the show takes place at 4 p.m. And as with every year, we think it provides a really stellar opportunity to connect with colleagues and celebrate the start of the new year. So hope to see you all there. And as always, watch the space that is the high space. And we look forward to helping advance your work, whether that's through the transformative turns in conversation that take place through events like this one this afternoon, our Seed Grants program, and support in the pursuit of various funding opportunities. So please be in touch. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Ruben Espinosa is Professor of English and Director of the Arizona Center for Medieval Renaissance Studies. He's author of Shakespeare on the Shades of Racism, Masculinity and Marian Efficacy in Shakespeare's England, editor of Shakespeare and Skin, and co-editor of Shakespeare and Immigration. His work has appeared in Shakespeare Quarterly, Shakespeare Studies, Shakespeare Bulletin, as well as in New Literary History, among other venues. He's the president of the Shakespeare Association of America and serves on the editorial boards of Shakespeare Quarterly, the early modern cultural studies book series at Palgrave, and on the executive board of Race Before Race. Curtis Austin is the associate professor in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies and the School of Social Transformation, acting director of the Humanities Institute, and a leading scholar of the Black Power movement. Professor Austin's work on African American history has rightly attenuated our focus to apprehend the capacious, wide-ranging social impacts of the Black Power movement, which persist in their transformative power today, expanding our understanding of the geographical scope of organizations like the Black Panther Party in the process. In his first book, Up Against the Wall, Violence and the Making and Unmaking of the Black Panther Party, his upcoming history of the San Francisco Eights, and a range of additional publications, Professor Austin's scholarship has the critical affect of reminding us of the many ways social movements can empower new and renewing visions for the terrain, engagement, aesthetics, and politics of social justice. And so I look forward to your conversation.
Thank you very much.
We appreciate that. And thank you all for coming, and thank those of you who are watching from afar, virtually. Again, my name is Curtis Austin. I just want to say very quickly that we started out thinking that this would be a panel with another person and myself. That other person is Professor Carlos Velez Ibanez. And even though, I don't know whether he's watching or not, but he couldn't come for health reasons, but he sent me an email, and I'm going to read it to you just really quickly. So I don't know if this violates his confidentiality, but I think it's all right. gets to.
It's not like it's being recorded or anything.
Right. Yeah, it sort of gets to the point that we were trying to make with this appropriation series. So he writes me, I just saw the important misappropriation presentation by Cristobal Martinez, which was part of our first one, right? I'm so sorry I would not be able to contribute, which he meant today. Just as a thought, for me, the key is the feeling state of helplessness that must always be generated by misappropriations, all without gauge permissions in or out of a community setting. The helplessness resulting has very little research behind it and is a temporal and emotive state rendering groups and individuals, I love this, without surcease or solution. It is in fact the stealing of emotion connected to the fact, practice, or presence without permission. And I really appreciated his email because I love Carlos, one, but also because it will help us do what we're attempting to do today. It's a great segue to my own comments, this stealing of emotions. And so I hope it's okay with him that I share that email with you. But I will get started here and tell you what's been on my mind. So in the image on the screen, you see black culture being appropriated. You have whites who wear their hair and black styles. You have whites who take rap, hip hop, essentially any kind of music, jazz, blues, gospel, and appropriate it for themselves, and also in fashion. Well, we're not going to be talking about any of that today. This is the last time you're going to see or hear anything about this. So I actually like the outfits. I mean, I'm not so offended by it and the hairstyles. I love cornrows. But the point is, a lot of times this is how we see appropriation, very narrow ways. And what I wanted to speak to you today was other ways that things can be appropriated. And because I'm a historian of the Civil Rights Movement, I want to talk to you about part of black history being appropriated, and in this case, being appropriated by the state, because what we see today, and by today I mean really since the movement ended in the 70s and 80s, is the state sort of identifying itself as a supporter and helper of the movement. It's the kind of thing you understand when you see a Martin Luther King, a Rosa Parks, or a Malcolm X, say, on a postage stamp, right? This is a federal thing. Like I'm not going to be on a postage stamp, right? So it makes it seem as if these were really good things. But the fact of the matter is, the federal government, as well as state and local governments, push back very hard against movement activists and the movement itself. And because it's such a broad topic, I thought that I'd get to it by talking about films that perhaps you've seen, and if you haven't, I hope you'll go and check out. But this is one way the state has been able to appropriate the history, the meaning, and what I claim, the legacy of the movement. So I'll just jump right in. Feature films like The Help, Mississippi Burning, and The Butler have been praised for their portrayal of historical moments in the black freedom struggle. Yet, these films have also been criticized for appropriating the narrative of the civil rights movement, often centering white characters or distorting the contributions of black organizations like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, sometimes known as SNCC, the NAACP, SCLC, which was Martin Luther King's group, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and groups like the Black Panther Party. And while these films claim to depict the struggles of African Americans, they often fail to adequately represent the radical and multifaceted nature of these movements, engaging in a process that simplifies and, more importantly, depoliticizes the very resistance they purport to honor. And so today, I will be discussing how these films have appropriated the black freedom struggle, diluting the contributions of pivotal organizations and figures while perpetuating a narrative that shifts the focus away from black agency and resistance. And so I'll start with The Help. This movie was directed by Tate Taylor. It's set in the 1960s, and it portrays a relationship between white women and their black maids in Jackson, Mississippi. The film, based on Catherine Stockett's novel of the same name, frames the story through the eyes of a young white journalist, Skeeter Phelan, who exposes the racial injustices endured by black domestic workers. While the film addresses themes of segregation, racism, and inequality, it does so through a lens that diminishes the agency of black characters and shifts the focus to white redemption. The black maids in The Help, particularly Abilene and Minnie, are shown as passive passive recipients of white benevolence, while the real-life activism of organizations like SNCC and the NAACP, both of which were highly active in the South during this period, goes unmentioned. SNCC played a central role in organizing voter registration drives and sit-ins, while the NAACP was instrumental in legal challenges to segregation and discrimination. Yet, The Help downplays this history of black activism instead of positioning Skeeter as a heroic figure who gives voice to black women. And so you see on the screen an image of Rosa Parks, who is being arrested the famous day in December of '55 when she refused to give up her seat on a bus, where blacks were, required to pay 10 cents in the front door, here you can see, and then get off the bus and walk to the back. And sometimes they'd pay their 10 cents and the bus would take off. And we're talking mostly maids, right? These are the people driving from the segregated black part of town across the tracks to the segregated white parts of town. And so this film that I'm talking about sort of shows that it's this white benefactor that makes everything go away, makes all this bad stuff go away, where in fact it was the activist who did this. And you, of course, know Martin Luther King Jr. He's 26 years old at the time, has just left university, newly minted PhD, comes to Montgomery, and there's this movement already going on. And these women, local women, ask him to lead the movement, and he says no. These local women go to his wife, Coretta, and says, hey, would you let him know we're not asking him? And next thing you know, he's the leader of the movement. But what happens is people in the police department, the local sheriff's department, people in federal government, then create a space and then sometimes engage in nefarious activity. So King gets his home bombed, right? But you still have these maids that we're talking about in this film. They're the ones who are walking to work for an entire year. Like, their employers are actually supporting the movement, contrary to what a lot of people know, because of course they want their houses clean, they want their food cooked, they want their children cared for, and their position was, their husbands are saying, screw that movement, leave those people alone, but they're saying, hey, unless you're gonna clean the house, we want to help these people. So when you watch The Help, you don't get any sense of this. You don't get any sense of the fact that the kind of reaction that they're getting is really, really violent. And you certainly don't get a sense of the fact that the people who we think of as ones who started the movement, in this case, is Rosa Parks here on the left and Claudette Colvin on the right, who actually refused to give up her seat long before Parks did. We don't know what it cost them. But what it cost Rosa Parks was she couldn't find a job in Montgomery to save her life. She wound up spending the rest of her life in Detroit because every job she applied for in Montgomery was like, no, you're that lady that started all this trouble, right? But you watch The Help and you don't get any sense of that. You don't get any sense that the state is the one that's doing all of this pushback. Same with the Freedom Rides, right? Here you see local officers in Montgomery who, this is how they feel about the Freedom Rides. Not only do they feel this way, but they behave in a certain way based on these feelings. And so when the Freedom Riders come through their part of the state, this is what happens to the buses. They bomb the buses, they get the people off the buses, and they wound up beating the people. But you don't get a sense of that in these movies that I'm talking about. So rather than highlighting the self-determination and bravery of the organizations that helped fuel the movement, the film reinforces the trope of white saviors rescuing powerless black characters. By framing the struggle against racism as one that required the intervention of sympathetic white people, The Help erases the reality of black resistance, particularly the efforts of grassroots activists who risk their lives to confront systemic oppression in the South. And so I want to just have you think for a minute about how this real history has been appropriated. I'll talk about it a little bit more, but these folks Some are vigilantes, some actually are police officers. They're beating the Freedom Riders. So this is the state pushing back on these things, and you can kind of see the outcome. Same with what happened in the state of Mississippi. The Freedom Riders get to Jackson, Mississippi, and they're immediately jailed. So you're talking misdemeanor type activity, right? They're riding these buses, and the idea is the black people are going to go to the white bathroom, and the white people are going to go to, I'm calling it black, but it was the colored bathroom, right?
Mhm.
That's not a felony. But these individuals wind up in Parchman Penitentiary, which is probably the worst penitentiary in the country. I'm pretty sure some other people might think if they're in the penitentiary, no, you're wrong. It's worse over here. But Mississippi is not known for hospitality in its prisons. So that's why I make that particular point. Again, it's the state that's pushing back. Another film that I want to highlight here is Mississippi Burning. Much older film, directed by Alan Parker. It dramatizes the 1964 murders of the three civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner. While the film captures the violence and hatred faced by civil rights activists, it does so by focusing almost exclusively on the perspective of two white FBI agents investigating the case. The narrative centers on the efforts of federal law enforcement, effectively sidelining the black activists and local leaders who were central to the civil rights struggle. And so, again, I just want to stop very quickly and point out that the government was not supportive of the movement. And this woman you see on the screen, Viola Lozo, is a teacher from Detroit, came down to help the movement in the South. Because she was helping the movement in the South, a truckload of Klansmen, one of which was working with the FBI, shot and killed her, right? And that was the end of it. And they did this big investigation, acted like they didn't know what was happening, but there was an FBI informant in the vehicle from which she was shot. Same with Jonathan Daniels. He came down from New York City, working with the movement. The sheriff, actually, in Selma, showed up after a march, was having an argument with the black woman, pulled out his shotgun to shoot the black woman. Jonathan Daniels goes to protect her. He kills Jonathan. Nothing ever happens to this person. Hundreds of people witness it. So again, it's the state that's pushing back against this progress. And again, with Mississippi Burning, this is an image of Goodman, Chaney, and Schwerner. And we know now, of course, it's some 60 years later, or a little bit more than that. This happened in '64. Actually, I guess it's 60 years this year, 2024. We know now that local sheriff's deputies, police officers, Mississippi State Highway Patrolmen, and FBI agents were involved in their abduction, and they knew that there was a 6-week search for their bodies. They eventually found their bodies in an earthen dam owned by the wealthiest person in the county, because he had been working with police officers, with FBI agents to say, hey, we don't want this change, we don't want these people, and this is the best way to get rid of them. And again, the best way is to kill them, right? So I'm gonna get to the part about appropriation really quickly here. Again, these people who are fighting for the progress that we currently enjoy and that we often take for granted are not being focused on. Instead, the focus is on the white authorities bringing the killers to justice, where in fact it was the white authorities involved in the killing. So this appropriation of the black freedom struggle is problematic on multiple levels. First, it perpetuates the notion that meaningful action against racial injustice came from outside forces, namely white federal agents, rather than from within the black community. Second, it downplays the contributions of SNCC and other black-led organizations that were directly challenging the power structures of the Jim Crow South. By centering white characters and their moral dilemmas, and you really, if you haven't seen it, have to watch this movie. I mean, I'm writing this as someone who has a PhD, but I saw this as someone who was just a young person, and I'm clapping the whole time, right? Because it looks real to me. Like I hadn't had the education to give me the information that I'm sharing with you today. So by centering white characters and their moral dilemmas, Mississippi Burning distorts the historical reality of the civil rights movement, presenting a sanitized version of events that diminishes black agency and leadership. And finally, I want to share with you my 2 cents on the film The Butler, which is a much more recent film. The Butler was directed by Lee Daniels, and it tells the story of Cecil Gaines, a black man who serves as a butler in the White House through several presidencies, from Dwight Eisenhower to Ronald Reagan. The film explores key moments in the civil rights movement, including the sit-ins, the freedom rides, and the rise of the Black Power movement and the Black Panther Party. However, much like The Help and Mississippi Burning, The Butler frames these events through the lens of individual characters rather than focusing on the collective struggle of black organizations. In the film, Cecil's son Lewis becomes involved with SNCC and later joins the Black Panther Party. And while the film acknowledges the existence of these organizations, it portrays them in a reductive and often problematic way. The portrayal of SNCC focuses on the tension between Lewis and his father, with the organization appearing as a backdrop to their personal conflict. So in other words, SNCC is not really doing anything. They're just kind of something for these kids to do in the summertime, which they were dedicating their lives to this. I'm from Mississippi. I know people today who came from the North in the 60s who still live in Mississippi, who are still working for the movement. And you don't get that from The Butler or many other films. The Black Panther Party, meanwhile, is depicted in a caricatured fashion, with its members portrayed as overly militant and disconnected from the broader civil rights struggle. By focusing on Cecil's internal journey and his relationship with his son, The Butler fails to fully capture the broader significance of organizations like SNCC and the Black Panther Party. These groups were not simply the domain of rebellious youth, but were vital to the larger struggle for black liberation. SNCC's voter registration drives and protests were pivotal to the movement's success. I mean, these 3 civil rights workers that I just previously mentioned were going around the county registering people to vote. That's why they were killed, not because they committed a crime, right? While the Black Panther Party's community programs and resistance to police brutality were a crucial response to systemic racism throughout the United States. In The Butler, the nuanced, multifaceted efforts of these organizations are reduced to personal conflict and family drama, effectively appropriating the historical significance of black resistance. While the film attempts to honor the contributions of civil rights activists, it ultimately falls into the trap of depoliticizing their work, framing it as part of an individual's moral journey rather than a collective fight for justice. And you can see here on the screen the kind of things the Black Panther Party sought, right? It is really, believe it or not, and I'm a historian of the Black Panther Party, and I hope none of them are watching, but I consider it a very reformist organization. It likes to think of itself as extremely radical. I mean, if you just want a good job, I don't see how radical that is. You know, if you just want good housing, if you just want adequate education, you don't even have to be in the movement to want these kind of things. So I don't know why they think they're so radical, but anyway, they're not here and I can say that. Anyway, films like The Help, Mississippi Burning, and The Butler engage in the appropriation of the black freedom struggle by simplifying, distorting, and erasing the contributions of key organizations like SNCC, the NAACP, SCLC, and the Black Panther Party. By centering white characters or focusing on individual narratives, these films shift attention away from the collective efforts of activists who risk their lives to confront racism and oppression. This appropriation is problematic because it reinforces the notion that the fight for civil rights required white intervention and leadership while downplaying the role of black agencies, where in fact, again, I've said it several times now, it's the state, whether it's the federal government, the state government, or local governments that's actually pushing back against the movement. Many of you may or may not know that 64% of all Americans opposed Martin Luther King in April of 1968, the month that he died. I mean, you just think about that. 64% is pretty high. But the way we talk about King today, I mean, people, why don't you be more like King? You know, rather than some of these other more radical formations. Well, I mean, King wasn't very well liked by most people. So maybe not the greatest advice. Just a little bit more about the Black Panther Party. The COINTELPRO destroyed this organization through doing these kinds of things, you know, preventing folks from getting together, killing off its leadership. One of the examples of that is Fred Hampton. He's the leader of the Chicago chapter of the party. He's going around actually uniting Native peoples, Latinx peoples, Asian peoples, white people, rich people, poor people, everybody who is for freedom. Hampton was successful in uniting. Well, this is what he got for his trouble. And you can see how very happy the individuals who are taking on this work are when they do this kind of thing. And in fact, Hampton's family won a several $1 million lawsuit because the lawyers proved that the federal government, the state of Illinois, and the Chicago police planned and then implemented a plan to murder Fred Hampton and another person by the name of Mark Clark. So, by engaging in this selective storytelling, the federal government in Hollywood perpetuate a distorted view of history that fails to honor the full complexity of the Black freedom struggle. True justice for the movement's legacy requires not only acknowledging the aesthetic and emotional appeal of civil rights stories, but also committing to an honest portrayal of the revolutionary spirit that drove these movements forward. And in conclusion, I just want to share what my larger point is, and that is the federal government and its appendages fought the progress of the movement from its very beginning, going so far as to partner with Klansmen and other vigilantes willing to kill Black activists. And I can say that in public because I actually have federal records that they wrote, where they wrote this down. Send you to the library where you can find them too if you want to. It also participated in the killing of activists like Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, Martin Luther King Jr., and Malcolm X. The government hated King, and I just mentioned, as did 64% of white Americans at the time he was murdered. So appropriating the movement for its own end, it has appropriated the entire meaning of the actual movement, cashing in on its financial attributes, diluting its meaning, and co-opting its legacy. This level of appropriation is a clear demonstration that this activity, while sometimes profitable for the appropriators, has its deepest meaning in the attempted erasure of history and the ultimate desire to control what the world sees, what it believes, and how it relates not just to the Black freedom struggle, but to Black people themselves. And so you think about how folks relate to, like when you hear the phrase Black Panther Party, you go, ooh, But in fact, these people are serving breakfast, giving people health care. Yes, they were against police brutality. But the real problematic folks are the folks that are going around killing the leaders. And so my point here is to say that this legacy and this history has been appropriated in a way that prevents us from understanding history in an accurate manner. And that is something that I hope we can talk about and clear up in the rest of this session. So thank you for your attention.
Thanks. Thank you, Curtis. So much less polished than Curtis, but in the same vein of thinking about the way that structures of white supremacy and the same notions that you're thinking about, that systemic racism, right, plays out, and the way that it filters its way into artistic mediums. I am looking at that through what seems to be the topic that's on my mind all day and every day. It's Shakespeare. So no surprise here. But really not like Curtis, not in the way of thinking about simply, right, how particular cultures are appropriated through the medium of Shakespeare, but instead how Shakespeare is appropriated for different ends, right, toward different ends, and what that means and why that should matter to us. And so I'm gonna start by thinking about who appropriates Shakespeare, right, who gets to appropriate Shakespeare, before looking at how we are appropriated through Shakespeare. And I want to begin with the Folger Shakespeare Library, which some of you might be familiar with, you might not, but the Folger Shakespeare Library is a cultural institution that holds the largest collection of Shakespeare memorabilia, and specifically the largest collection of first folios in the world. It is to say, you have one Shakespeare folio is millions of dollars depending on how clean it is, right? And to think about them having upwards of, I don't know the exact number, but 80 something, I believe, it is immense. The origins of the library are interesting. Henry Folger, who is from the Folger family, people always ask, is it the same coffee? It's the same family, right? But he's not the guy who did the coffee. He worked for Standard Oil at the time. under Rockefeller, and this was a kind of a hobby of his. He didn't want people to know about it. He felt it would dilute from his professional persona, right, and what he was at Standard Oil as a CEO. And so his wife helped him quite a bit, and they would track down these old objects, these books, and they were secretly buying them. By the time the kind of British book collectors caught wind of it, they were like, we've lost like almost all of them. Why don't we have? And so they started in on it, and there was a mad race to get as many as he could. But he continued in his life, and the idea was he was housing them, he had them, and then ultimately he started buying property on Capitol Hill, little by little. And so anytime property would go up, he was buying this block. And at that point, government was going to expand, I think, the Library of Congress right at that point, and they were going to kind of call eminent domain on that land. And he caught wind of this, and he was like, no, this is all my property, and I have something in mind here. So he had to come clean, and he said, look, this is what I have. And of course, the government supported that, and they were like, whoa, this is great. He's going to gift this to the American people. All of you all get Shakespeare because of Henry Folger, right? Oh. That's the idea, right? So he builds it. He has this place, and there it is. Folger Shakespeare Library is in existence today. It's massive, and we have quite a bit of programming through them, and events and archival research takes place there, and it's an important institution where Shakespeare is concerned. Fast forward to January 6th, right? The insurrectionists are going to Capitol Hill. It sits on Capitol Hill. They're going to Capitol Hill, and the Folger Shakespeare Library gets a letter from the organizers. Protect the vote, I believe was the name that they were calling themselves. They sent a typed letter, right, but a physical letter to the Folger Shakespeare Library saying, on January 6th, we are planning to protest, right, in your neighborhood, and we want to give you, essentially giving them a heads up, right? We just want to let you know, we mean no disturbance to your institution, right, but there are going to be a lot of people, so you should know this. They said, we also sent one to the Library of Congress, which they didn't. So it was just the Folger Shakespeare Library. They wanted to give them a heads up that they were coming on that day and to inform them. And so now it's in their permanent collection in their archive. And the idea, like for most of us who study this, is a recognition that for them, right, for those individuals involved in that insurrection, Shakespeare sits atop of that racial hierarchy, right? He is the epitome of what they consider white exceptionalism. And this is particularly, it's their view of Shakespeare. It's that perception that this is what he holds and this is why he's valuable. And make no mistake about it, I mean, in the same way that Curtis is thinking about the forms of state, right, informing the way that this violence is going to be enacted, that same ideological structure, right, persists in the way that we think about what Shakespeare holds from its beginnings. When I think about Henry Folger, and I was doing some research in my book, looking at Mary Turner, right, and the lynching of Mary Turner. I mean, this transpired in Georgia, but one of the people who brutally attacked her, right? And it's a horrific story. They cut out an unborn child from her belly and stomped on it in a horrific manner. Was an accountant for Standard Oil at the time that Henry Folger was a CEO. I don't make that connection to suggest Henry Folger's involved, but this is around the time period, right, that this is taking shape. At that same time, once the library was open, the first director of the library, Joseph Quincy Adams of the Quincy Adams family, right? He was the first director. In his inaugural speech, he called it, right? He said, this is a preservation of the language of the American people at a time when immigrants are coming in like locusts to steal our culture, to steal our language, and to think about. This is the way he imagined immigration. Yeah, so all of it kind of has this origin in anti-immigrant sentiments, right? All the way to January 6th, where you think about that white exceptionalism and this notion of a kind of white ownership of Shakespeare. Now, that is an appropriation of Shakespeare that differs vastly from the tenor of what the field holds for us right now. We have multiple appropriations of Shakespeare that are exciting. We have perceptions of Shakespeare from multiple cultural perspectives, racial perspectives, right, that are taking place and making it very exciting. And so it comes as no surprise that the institution has shifted, it's changed. To his credit, the last director, Michael Whitmore, was very much instrumental in shepherding the Folger Shakespeare Library to where it is today, making it a more welcome space, right, and a place where people want to attend. But in his stepping down, they conducted a search for the next director, and that person is going to be Farah Kareem Cooper, who is a Pakistani-American who has been working at Shakespeare's Globe for the past many, many years. She will be taking over October the 1st, and when the public got wind of this, it was very exciting. People felt like she's a great scholar, she's the right scholar to do this. It's exciting, very happy, and then of course the articles began pouring out. Yeah, you have the reaction to this, right? You know, woke Shakespeare, right? We are getting a woke Shakespeare. It's a shame that the institution is looking in a direction that does not honor the past, that does not think about a Shakespeare, right, for what he is, that doesn't really admire the language in the way that it should be admired, right? And what we have instead is this director who dared to question how Shakespeare's capital, right, in terms of thinking about how he's been propped up. The title of her recent book is The Great White Bard, right? And she's thinking about this sense of that type of appropriation and ownership of Shakespeare, right, that excludes these many voices for so long, which are now, I think, becoming very much the focal point for scholarship and for thinking about Shakespeare and appropriation. But nonetheless, I mean, this is what I think we expect anytime that you have somebody who does not look the part, right, who does not speak the part, take the leadership, right, in those roles. And our own Ayanna Thompson is similar in her manifold roles, right, within the Shakespeare Academy. And so this is one way, to think about how then do we approach the appropriation of Shakespeare to different ends here, right, and navigate those pressures, right, the same pressures that exist where he is the epitome or he is a marker of white exceptionalism to this very day. That is a perception here, right? He is a marker of white exceptionalism. If somebody else is telling you what Shakespeare means who is not white, then that seems to belie that particular idea, right? And yet within it holds so much. In a recent podcast with Ayanna, she was asked, like, why, did you study race? Kind of like, was this your entry into it, and when you were working on your doctorate? And she was like, no, like, none of us did. She's like, I don't think like any of us doing Shakespeare did. And her answer was like quite the contrary, right? It was this kind of teaching of Shakespeare as having to do nothing. She says, I remember in my first, kind of graduate seminar, the professor said, like, Shakespeare would not have come across a black person or a non-white person in the entirety of his life. And even the podcast, interviewer scoffed and was like, let's go straight to Shakespeare jail, right? And I mean, it's the reality is the name of the theater was, Shakespeare's Globe. I mean, this was a sense of very much diverse audiences and societies at that time. England had seen its biggest, influx of immigrants during the reign of Elizabeth. We have Imtiaz Habib's work, who has proved that there were, black people in London at that time. And we do have, it's called Black Lives in the English Archives, right? Much more diverse than we are taught to believe. But this is only coming out in the 80s and 90s, and people are really looking and thinking about this. And the idea is absolutely in line with the notion that it is a whitewashed past, right? That is a common and kind of understandable way of thinking about Shakespeare only within the walls of that whiteness here, right? And not having to think about it outside of those walls, what that might mean in this regard here, right? And so this is why these narratives persist within the alt-right movements here, right? Within the January 6th insurrectionists, in the same way that they co-opt medieval iconography to imagine a medieval world absent of people of color, which is, as Cord Whitaker says, laughable, right? This notion. But nonetheless, right, it serves a particular end and a particular purpose. It's appropriating Shakespeare to, again, perpetuate the idea of white exceptionalism and thus have the notion of white supremacy strictly in place. Now, who appropriates us? Well, the Shakespeareans, right? And this has happened over time. So thinking about as a Chicano coming to Shakespeare, right, and thinking about as a brown-skinned man, like, what does that mean? Where do I find myself in Shakespeare? And that's not really the end. I'm not coming to this. I don't take in a movie much like yourself. I can appreciate a movie that's absent of people of color and say, like, this is Shakespeare. This is good. It is interesting, though, when you do begin to see people think about, like, how can we make this more diverse in its leaning? So you begin with West Side Story, with, an adaptation that many celebrate, right, an appropriation of Shakespeare, despite the fact that you have many actors in that film rendition who are in brownface, right? There you have some sense of cultural appropriation and thinking about Shakespeare in that way. Fast forward to Baz Luhrmann's Romeo plus Juliet, a film that people, it's beloved, right? It's a wonderful. I will admit, I love it myself here. Right? You have aspects of it that are great, but Baz Luhrmann really does employ that kind of facile binary, right, of the divide between the Latinx population here, right, and the white population, and you have the white Montagues with Leonardo DiCaprio and his family here, right, and then you have the brown Capulets here, right, represented by Claire Danes, right, as the lead Latina in that. And so you have this sense here, right? Even John Leguizamo has spoken about this after the fact here, right? He stars as Tybalt in a really kind of wonderful role. But just yesterday at the Emmys, he actually on stage called out the different filmmakers who had made films, right, about Latinx people here, right, but casting white actors to play those particular parts. And he used that platform to say, look, this is something that is ongoing, right? It's still happening. And so we see some of that with Baz Luhrmann. The flip side of that, and I will come to this, and I think this is where I feel like there is an opportunity here to really appropriate Shakespeare in a way that has another ends in sight here, right, for audiences, and as we look forward to the future of Shakespeare studies. The firm belief has always been that Shakespeare will endure. He's not going anywhere. He's a staple. It's great. We have, the story has always been, he is the most performed playwright even to this very day here, right? And so theaters always bank on that. Interestingly, there is current research by Ayanna Thompson that is showing that is not the case. There's actually a decline in the stagings of Shakespeare and the uses of Shakespeare. And so her motivation in thinking about this is like, how do we look to a future where it remains relevant? And it really is thinking about the larger populations here and people who are embarking on appropriating Shakespeare. And so for me, I have kind of, two, three examples I think that I can use. Back in 2015-16, I was invited to do a piece for a collection that never came to be, but thankfully this piece found another home. But I was looking at Mexican identities in YouTube Shakespeare. So just essentially mining YouTube and thinking about where do we see Mexican, actors, Mexican students, Mexican identities in Shakespeare. And so it was a lot of watching really, really bad YouTube adaptations, which are great. I think a lot of them actually are great to find the ones. But what I noticed coming up again and again were these adaptations by white students, typically college age or sometimes high school students, right, who would don Mexican identities in their performance of Shakespeare for no other seeming reason than to poke fun at Mexicans. And so just to give you one example, there was a Hamlet adaptation where the character, Hamlet was Mexican, but he was a mechanic, right? And his father was a yard worker, right? And Mexican as well. And it was a way for them to use Shakespeare's language, but give it a kind of feigned Mexican, Spanish accent, right? And to poke fun at this particular group. And, you watch it from beginning to end, and the only reason would be just to ridicule Mexicans in that, right? And so it's kind of surprising, but I saw this come up again and again. And others where you have the Mexican character, it would often be Horatio. And I assume it's because Horacio. I don't know any other reason, but it's kind of this weird, but it gives them a vehicle to kind of display their racism, right, and these racist views of Latinxes. And so this was one area where I thought it was, kind of like these adaptations were very much being used in similar ways as a vehicle. And this is not only in the realm of YouTube Shakespeare, Shakespeare's Globe, in fact, right, much later, I think, during their Globe to Globe Shakespeare, so it might have been around 2017, around there, had adaptation of Much Ado About Nothing that was set in colonial Mexico. And the only reason I can think that they did this is just for the vibrancy of colors, right? And so that playwright, we just had last year a scholar in residence here. He was spending his sabbatical at ACMRS, but Alfredo Michel Modenesi, who has written about this, and he says, these directors, art directors, were sent to Mexico to do, research on their adaptation of the play. And it was Frida Kahlo's, Blue House. He's like, which is like blocks away from where I live. He's like, had they had any desire, they could have, sent me an email and I would have gladly shown them parts of Mexico. But they go back, and it has mariachi music, and as he says, right, mariachi music with percussion, like, I don't And so he's very much attacked like what the Globe was doing. But you did have characters on stage in brownface, right? And this was something that they were trying to get across. It was kind of like this Shakespeare set in Mexico, but still with all of these white actors who are doing it. So to relegate YouTube is not, not an adequate, assessment of what happens with Shakespeare in this regard. The positive view of that, I think, is that you do have people who are appropriating and thinking about Shakespeare to comment on their own lived experiences, right, and what they have. One is close to home, and that happened in the Tucson Independent School District, roughly around 2005. And this was a Mexican-American studies program led by a man named Curtis Acosta, who I think is still teaching. This was the dawn of the kind of famous banned books controversy in Tucson High School. And what happened is he was teaching a Mexican-American studies program, and at that same time, Dolores Huerta was brought in as a keynote speaker to that high school, right? She's a very much social activist, right? She came in, allowed for racial profiling, right? And it was just this kind of awful way of trying to get as many Mexicans, out as possible. And Dolores Huerta went in and she said very candidly, she said, look, many of you are old enough to vote, you will be old enough to vote, you need to use your voices and your confidence. And she said, you need to know that Republicans hate Latinos. She said that at the school. Now, she's an invited speaker. She can say whatever she wants, right? And that's what she said. At the time, the superintendent, Tom Horn, who is now the superintendent of Phoenix School District, was incensed because he's a staunch Republican, and he said, no, he sent his own aide to go and do a counter student, assembly, and they called them all back in, and they said she was there to tell them that Republicans do not, in fact, hate Latinos, right? And as they did this, many of the students turned their backs on her and raised their fists in the air, right? And it was a kind of powerful moment to these students, and he then made it his mission to dismantle the Mexican American Studies program, which he did. And what they did is they passed legislation under Janet Brewer to say, if you teach anything that broaches the topic of race, right, or immigration in this way here, right, you will be found accountable, and teachers that could actually be fined, and the school would actually be fined as well, upwards of like hundreds of thousands of dollars. So they didn't actually ban the books. They made them go and identify the books. And this can happen organically. I could be teaching something and you could say like, well, that sounds like kind of a colonial, colonizing type of mentality. And if you brought the word of colonizing, which was one of the trigger words, right, that cannot come up in a classroom, then I would be found guilty and in violation of that, even though I did not say that, make that statement. So they were looking for the text that would do this, essentially emptying out everything they were teaching in that Mexican American Studies program. This was all to say, amid that list of books that they studied in that program was Shakespeare's The Tempest. And because of that, right, when it was like they're banning and outlining these books in Tucson High School, right, because Shakespeare was in that, suddenly it became national news. And I think they did use it as a vehicle to say, like, look, they're wanting to ban Shakespeare in Arizona. What's wrong with them, right? And it was a way to allow them a platform to utilize, to appropriate, and to think about his cultural capital. Because that's it. I think you take ownership over a cultural object that gives you some sense of power in that type of appropriation, right? To then showcase, right, that injustice. And what they did is, others came in. Tony Diaz from Texas came in and he said, how can we help? And they created this group called Libro Traficante, and they got all those books and they actually toured initially the Southwest and promoting the teaching of these particular books that started getting ground. People wanted to see what that syllabus looked like, and it exploded. And then ultimately that legislation was overturned. And so there is a sense, but what is heartbreaking in terms of, like, coming back to what Curtis is thinking about, the reality on the ground, right, is that in this program, right, a University of Arizona study found the following year that the Mexican American Studies program at Tucson High School increased not only graduation rates here, right, but college enrollment for those students. And as one of my colleagues, Peter Holland at Notre Dame, said, he's like, when you look at the statistics behind that, it is not only the Latinx students. He's like, you're talking about 60% of the people in the Mexican American Studies program were Latinx. The other 40% are, other students, right, who do not have a background in that, who are learning about this, right? And this is the seeming goal, right? This is what we have to offer. And so thinking about it as a vehicle for that, I think is for me, very, very exciting. The piece that I want to end with is one that happened directly after the public murder of George Floyd here, right? And that was Everybody's in lockdown, right? We are all at home. The Public Theater in New York is doing some programming, but at that point, they put out what I think is, to date, their most exceptional work, and it's a video called #ToBeBlack. You can find it on YouTube. It's amazing, and what they did was compile 30 Black actors, right, and had them recite the "To Be or Not to Be" speech from Hamlet. And that speech is about the exhaustion of existence, right? This is Hamlet in a moment where it's just like too much for him to bear, right? And he's just thinking about how exhausting it is to be alive. To put that speech in the mouths of those Black actors in that historical moment, I think was gut-wrenching for every viewer. It brought me to tears. It's just, and what they did was splice in the opening, right? These Black Lives Matters protests from that moment, and then look back at the Civil Rights era protests, right? And then set it to Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit, and then you have them reciting it, and then you come to the end. And it's when you think about the endurance and the universality of Shakespeare here, right? But really to think about how long-lived that speech is, right? And how it has no end. They're juxtaposing that with the long arc of history when it comes to racism as well. And so that is, I think, an appropriation of Shakespeare that has teeth and the ones that we should be looking for. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Edifying. So what we want to do now is open it up to you. Get your feedback, your questions, and your comments. And to you online as well. If you have questions that you'd like to ask or comments you'd like to make, we welcome those. Anyone? Yes, sir.
Thank you for both, first of all. It's a really amazing panel. I'll try to keep it short. I have two short questions for you, Curtis, and one for Ruben, if
Okay.
that's okay.
Sure.
One of the things that I was just thinking about when you were talking about the state appropriation of these movements in the civil rights era is that I wonder whether you find that there's a conscious sort of de-emphasis or like that the appropriations on part of the state wish to de-emphasize any potential internationalism behind these movements, which are sometimes like extremely globally aware, and then kind of there are people who travel beyond the bounds of the state, and whether you find that in these movies or in other presentations of civil rights history, there's a need to kind of narrow the focus into this is simply a thing that was happening within the states in order to like not make it about any form of broader connection, whether that be economic or whether that be through linked liberation struggles, so on and so forth. Second question that I had for you was a question of genre, where these films seem like they are almost like straight historical fiction, taking a realist approach at like portraying a particular moment in American history. And whether you find that the medium of doing a historical drama, whether it's in like modern film today or in any of these films, brings something different than something like speculative fiction when it comes to thinking about a historical moment. So like the example that was going on in my mind was, I think it's like the opening episode of Lovecraft Country, one of these recent serials where the folks are relatively anonymous, nobody famous is involved, but in order to demonstrate like what a sunset town actually means, then cosmic horror gets invoked in order to like really make the emotional landscape of this thing come alive in a different way than you could do potentially with straight historical fiction. So I'm curious whether you find like there's a genre difference that informs how the appropriations work on both sides. And should I ask Ruben or?
Well, I'll try to answer very quickly. The first one, simply yes. Because the Black Panther Party is a part of the Black Power movement. And what we see happening is there is a focus when it comes to this appropriation on the civil rights movement, right? Rather than the Black Power movement, because the Black Power movement is seen by some as much more radical, much more militant, much more dangerous, and therefore deserving of whatever happens to it. Whereas when you think about activists like a Fannie Lou Hamer, Rosa Parks, or Martin Luther King, all very palatable personalities, very moderate in their approaches to social change. And so that focus says, these are the good activists. And these are the bad ones over here. And it definitely excludes any notion of internationalism. I mean, when Stokely Carmichael made that speech on Black Power in June of 1966, within a month, there were Black Power organizations in New Zealand, Australia, East Africa, the Caribbean, Brazil, you name it. And you don't get any of that when you think about the Black Power movement from this kind of approach in film. So I would say, yes, definitely. And if you could just really quickly re-ask the second question
Yes.
about the genre.
So like, do you find that there's a difference when you watch or you see one of these appropriations that's committed to like ontological realism and like history as this is a historical portrait of a thing that is happening in the way that we all understand reality to work, versus something like, you know, I thought of Lovecraft Country as one that is kind of thinking of cosmic horror as well. Obviously, there are not tentacled elvish gods like living underneath, but like, what if there were? And we'll use that in order to kind of paint the feeling of what it's like to have to drive through a sunset town or something like that. Or I think Watchmen is another good example. Like, there are various things that are not committed to using how we think reality works, like anything speculative, like in horror particularly, in order to portray what is like a historical reality. And whether you think that there's actually a difference in terms of how either of these things can be appropriated, and like whether one of these things is appropriated more, or whether there's more fertile ground, or whether there's a conversation to be had between the genre mediums.
I think the more fertile ground is going to be in these feature films to do what it is we're talking about, whereas I think we all approach a show like Lovecraft Country as this is fiction.
Right.
Like, we can suspend belief here, and whatever happens kind of happens. But when I watch Selma, you know, when I watch The Butler or The Help, you know, I'm thinking, and I'm really talking about the universal. I don't do that anymore personally, but before I got a PhD, I believed what I saw on the big screen.
Right.
I don't when I watch shows like what you're describing, and so I think there is a difference that you can get away with a lot more in one than you can the other.
But in that sense, it's almost, I would assume, more critical to actually double down on the historical dramas in a way that doesn't let itself be informed by the state.
Yes, absolutely.
Quick question for you. I know this is like almost a footnote off of the presentation you were giving, but one of the things that you were mentioning with the Folger and the general cultural investment in Shakespeare was this admiration of language concept, right? And
Yeah.
I was just wondering what you thought about what happens to the idea of admiring this sort of shibboleth language that is extremely arcane and nobody actually uses it. What happens in appropriations that are also translations?
Yeah.
So, I mean, does the same spirit survive in any which way, where we are also admiring a certain register of language when this is translated into another medium, or is that actually ground for moving away from the whole idea of there is a language to be admired? Like, I know it's weird because it's also highly qualitative judgment.
Yeah, I know it's a good question. I don't do translation studies, right? But I'm thinking about something like a tradaptation is a term that they are using here, right? So an adaptation into a different language, but also moving away from what exactly it is that Shakespeare's plays hold is, I think, one area of adaptations that has a lot of power here, right? Because I think when you're treating Shakespeare as sacrosanct, either in his language, right, in his form and what he has, and that's the danger of keeping it, maybe danger is too harsh a word, right? But that certainly preserves a perspective of Shakespeare that's in place here, right? And so already when it's in translation, it's fraught. I think people feel like, when it's translated, those who do translation studies will look for, how close is it? So Alfredo's work, for example, is very much in line with that. But there's still, I think, in a general sense, this perception of it like this is a good thing, right? It's being translated into Spanish, it's being translated into Arabic, it's being translated into Japanese, because the idea is you're taking Shakespeare, right, and showing his value in these different places, right, different languages. when Oregon Shakespeare Festival tried to update Shakespeare's language because some of the jokes, let's face it, are just not funny, for our modern audiences, right? They had staged Shakespeare in other languages to great success and admiration. But when they staged Shakespeare and wanted to do this, there was a lot of pushback on that. And the reason was people felt like it was moving away from Shakespeare's language, right? But yet it's okay if it's in Spanish that's moving away from Shakespeare's language. And so there's this desire to preserve a language which, let's face it too, for general audiences, right, is sometimes difficult to comprehend, and that is the reason they wanted to update it. They were like, these jokes aren't landing. It's not funny, right? And so this is it. But there's still this kind of sense of like what that language should be, and I think that is a sticking point for so many people who want to preserve that, highlight that, and kind of admire that. It's the English that's important.
Okay, sounds like we have one from online, and I will get back to the local audience.
The two online attended questions. First is from the Professor Dave Bossum. He said, thanks for two stimulating presentations during the talk. I was thinking about the kind of appropriation we are discussing here. In Curtis' talk, we learned about examples of what we might call narrative appropriation, pretty different in some ways conceptually from, say, appropriating corn, rose or black textile traditions. In the second talk, we are discussing perhaps the appropriation of Shakespeare as a culture icon symbol. Do you think there is a value in theorizing these distinctions in the kinds of appropriation, or is it more useful to focus on the commonalities of the phenomenon? My question is for either or both of the presenters.
I can, thinking about. So theorizing, yes. I mean, the short answer to that is yes, and it's been done. And there's was a big move in Shakespeare studies, right, to think about the difference between adaptation and appropriation, and certainly trying to define appropriation along the lines of theft, exploitation, right, and how we're thinking about how some appropriate one culture to strengthen another culture, right, and how that matters. And I think a very pedestrian way of coming into that theorizing is essentially suggesting that appropriation has much more of a kind of a social justice-minded approach in thinking about why that matters, as opposed to an kind of strict adaptation of Shakespeare here, right? And so the appropriation also affords opportunities to see it not necessarily as like, I'm going to do Hamlet in this particular way here, right? But maybe appropriate Shakespeare in certain moments that have nothing to do with Shakespeare, right? To draw on his cultural capital to either showcase the strength of it, right? Or to interrogate it, right? And so I think that's important. It can't, that's to say, I think they're part of the same structure in that regard. And so, the question in terms of cultural appropriation in the way we're thinking about somebody who might, have a Cinco de Mayo themed party, right, and allow for people to just don Mexican identities, for fun or whatever the case might be here, right? It is still recognizing that there is a dominant system of power and that dominant default position is always whiteness, right? Yeah.
Another question is from Dr. Ron Broglio. He's on sabbatical, but he will join us.
He shouldn't be working.
Is all borrowing from a minority culture appropriation? What are some good examples of the respectful use of another culture versus appropriation?
All borrowing is not bad, especially if there's some acknowledgement of where this comes from, who it belongs to, and what it is you're trying to achieve in that situation. I don't necessarily think so. If you take the 60s, for example, the Afro became a big thing. Before the 60s, black people thought of themselves as Negroes, right? And being a Negro meant, one of the many things it meant was you needed to be clean cut, right? You know, shaved, hair short. In the 60s, Negroes became black people, and black people wanted to be natural. And so people started wearing their hair in a natural way, right? Absolutely nothing wrong with that change. And I see absolutely nothing wrong with a white person, an Asian person, a Latinx person wearing an afro, right? And whether they want to explain, this is why I'm wearing this or not, I wouldn't necessarily find problematic. Now, I'm gonna let Ruben respond if he wants, because I want to think about the second part of that question, which is what are some good examples? There are some, but I want to think about it for just a second if you have.
I don't have more insight than that. I think I agree with you completely in regard to that. When there is a recognition of that appropriation, right, and it doesn't feel like it's theft per se here, right, or ridiculing or a mimicking, right, I think that is something that is valuable. And I can't think of any. I hesitate to give an example myself because.
So okay, I'm just going to go with the music, the good example of the music I find, and I think I'm probably going to be disagreed with my friends if they happen to see this, but we'll take Eminem, the white rap artist from Detroit, right? He makes it very clear, I'm using this genre, which came from black people,
Yeah.
and I recognize that, but this is my purpose for doing what I'm doing. If you listen to his early music, not so much the stuff that he's doing now, right? But if you listen to his earliest music, he provides every piece of information you need if you're a black person and you're wondering whether you should listen to a white rapper, right?
Yeah.
I was young enough to think, what in the hell is he doing singing these songs? But if you look at his liner notes, if you actually listen to the words he's using in his raps, to me, that is appropriation. Right? And again, a lot of my black friends are going to disagree with that, but I think that's a good example. And maybe Ron knows Eminem, and if he doesn't, he should listen to it. Yeah. Okay. So back to our public audience, our local audience, anyone?
Thank you for the talk. I guess, like most of us, when I think of appropriation, I think of it within the frames of cultural appropriation and like artifacts of culture or performatives of culture. But then when I think of Shakespeare's text as a, coming from a performance studies perspective, my approach to it is, like, I guess my question is, if we also come from a post-structuralist way of dealing with the text, like Codian, so like I write about Musriger's stagings of Shakespeare, and I don't think of them necessarily as adaptation, and I don't think of them as appropriation, although there's a way to do that too. But I guess like I'm a little bit troubled by considering it within appropriation, because then I feel like then we're declaring that Shakespeare is of white culture. It's an artifact of white culture. And of course it is, but it's also not. It also belongs to the empire. It also belongs, there were slaves already, like Queen Anne's ceremonies included, black people as their creation. It was, you kind of went over that. So when I feel like when we say these people took Shakespeare and appropriated it, then we're saying Shakespeare belongs to white people, and then they took that and did that. And this is, kind of related to, but also separate from how we can take text and read it differently. Yeah. And I don't mean it as cultural artifact because, like, for instance, I'm from Istanbul, from Turkey, and Shahmaran, this epic narrative, it's, told all the time. There are TV shows, movies, etc., etc. Yet it's actually Kurdish culture. It's completely appropriated, and that's not recognized. So something is really erased in the retelling or making those shows of it with like saying it belongs to Turkey. So that's, I mean, something different, but also it's more like oral tradition. It's not exactly text. I
Yeah.
still feel like if we're just referring to the text, yes, anybody can take it and then make something with it. I guess it's like two questions in one.
Yeah.
One with that complication of like, what if like we're positioning ourselves as like post-structuralists and our relationship with the text is really independent of the author, even if it's Shakespeare.
Yeah.
But also, you know, this other thing of, you know, by saying that this group appropriated Shakespeare, aren't we then saying Shakespeare belongs to white culture?
So the short answer is no. I don't think that in suggesting that, say, a group of Latinx students who, you know, utilize the Tempest to talk about the injustices that they're facing in Tucson in any given moment, you're right, that appropriation would be, you know, the Shakespeare belongs to white culture, but we're using it in this. I don't think Shakespeare belongs to anybody, but the appropriation to talk about that social justice issue is the appropriation that I have in mind. Same with the January 6th insurrectionists. They're appropriating a Shakespeare to match their ends. Otherwise, it's just a staging of Shakespeare, and that's a dime a dozen. I mean, I'm from El Paso, Texas, and we have a Shakespeare company there called Shakespeare on the Rocks, and every season they produce Shakespeare plays. For the better part of my young adult life, you know, when I would go and watch these plays, that was just a staging of Shakespeare. I would not call that appropriation, even if it's an all Latinx cast. Like, they weren't doing anything with Shakespeare that was addressing the injustices or addressing the lived experiences of those characters. It was just young actors playing Shakespeare. And that could have been in any given place or locale, and that's a dime a dozen that happens across the world, or there are just stagings of Shakespeare. There are ways to appropriate Shakespeare's work, right, to reach a particular end that people might have in mind, whether that end is racist and has happened before, right, or whether that end is somehow challenging the structure. So Sri Lanka is a good example of that. I think they were disallowed to write plays and perform them, you know, that in any way would incite any kind of violence or resistance. And what they ended up doing is using Shakespeare as a vehicle to do that, so that they could kind of wash their hands and tell the government, we're just staging Shakespeare, like this is it. But they were smart enough to know the way that particular plays, right, were enacted, and, you know, what they were doing with that particular play, appropriating in this way, would speak to the injustices that they were facing and ways to address that. And so I don't think it's them saying, well, Sri Lankans are appropriating this, you know, kind of default white, you know, text, as it were. It's just they're appropriating that text to reach a particular end that has a goal in mind that is, I think, you know, again, social justice oriented in that way. Again, the flip side of that is white supremacy, right? And that has been happening time and time again. And that is also a form of appropriation. So that's the distinction that I make. Your question is not, it's not unlike that those who work on appropriation and adaptation studies struggle with, right? And this has been, you know, the earlier question about this is along those lines. Is there a theorization of it? Absolutely. And like any kind of theorization, right, there's going to be room for people to disagree, and that's welcome. I think that's right. I think questioning that, like, who owns Shakespeare, is tricky, right? From my estimation, like, nobody owns Shakespeare, right? He's not the ownership, but he certainly has been imagined as white property. And that is something that, at least from our end, those of us working on critical race studies of Shakespeare, are interrogating very forcefully, right? Because it's not, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a quick note on that. Even that example with Sri Lankan practitioners, it still assumes that there is this one original reading of Shakespeare, and then everything is then a spin-off of that, whether it's appropriation or something else. And I feel like that's the that's something post-structuralism completely rejects.
Yeah.
That might have been the mainstream one, but that's not necessarily that, because once we're positioning, I mean, regardless of the very positive associations to do with social justice or recognizing their work, but once we position a group of practitioners as like appropriating the material, then we're also robbing them of the right to claim that material completely as their own. And that is the complication that I'm feeling here, because anybody should be able to claim interpreting Shakespeare to their end.
Yeah.
And that could be, maybe that is the way it needs to live.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, we're probably going to disagree on the terminology, right? But I think exactly what you're saying is what appropriation is. It's claiming ownership over it here, right? And that in some ways is is a sticking point. I completely respect where you're coming from. Yeah.
Thank you. We are coming to the end of our time, but if anyone else has another question, we're happy to take it. Okay, well, thank you all for coming. Thank you for your thoughtful and incisive questions. And I would like for you to join me in thanking our panelists here.
Thank
Professor
you.
Espinosa. I mentioned early on that we were going to have someone else, and that person couldn't come, and on very short notice. I mean, it's almost impossible to find a professor, a director who has time in this very short, just this hour. And he said yes, and he came, and I'm so grateful. I learned a lot, so thank you.
It's just because you said yes to me. We're doing another event.
Thank you.
Thank you, Curtis.
Thank you all. We'll see you at the next event.